Alright, guys, welcome back. Here today to take you guys through a very interesting topic. I have a lot of people who do come and ask me a few questions on whiskey, and I've seen a lot of people actually giving their perspectives. And you know, I'm going to try to ensure that we're on the same page in terms of what today's topic is going to be. We're here to discuss a very interesting subject on what is single malt. Obviously, I have a lot of people who, and there are a lot of people rather, who have their own definition of what exactly a single malt is. I've heard a couple of people telling me it's one malt, a couple of people telling me one barley, and a couple of people who actually come out and don't even know what it is. So don't you worry, I'm here, and I'm going to try and ease it out for you guys as much as possible. Single malt is a style of whiskey where single and malt do not have any relation, funnily, right? In this case of single malt, single means one distillery, and malt means all barley. I'm sure you guys would have come across many bottles with the tag of single malt, and you might be wondering, oh, a hundred pipers or a Ballantines, for example. I'm in Bangalore. I'm able to get it between 3,000 and 3,500. But why am I paying 5,000 and upwards or 4,000 and upwards for a single malt whiskey? Worry not, because I'm here to sort that out for you guys today. Like I was saying, single malt is a very, very unique style of making whiskey. And I say unique not because of the fact that it can be someone's favorite, or it can be something to do with the variety of single malt that you get, right? So back in the Prohibition era, in probably 1890s, if I'm not wrong, single malt emerged as the whiskey that people really want to go to. Not for anything else, but it's authentic. Nobody could mess around with the quality of single malt that a distillery would make. Because back in the day, people used to just take neutral spirit, uh, or would take a vodka, add a bit of color, and then call it a blended whiskey, and people wouldn't really know. So single malt came as one of the most prominent inventions from probably, like I said, late 1890s or mid 1890s during the Prohibition era. So we're talking of almost 180 to 200 years of, my bad, we're talking of a little over 120 years of this style of whiskey. You guys might be wondering why I'm only reviewing single malts. It is definitely my go-to when it comes to whiskeys, but I also love a lot of blended whiskeys, Indian blended whiskeys, blended Scotch, American blended, so on and so forth. But today, I thought rather than just reviewing, I will probably have a really nice topic of how single malts are made, where they originate, and different types. So stick on. So, as a country that we live in, India is now picking pace with single malt. We have brands like Amrut, who happened to be the first ever single malt that emerged in India, followed by one of my personal favorites, no bias, but Paul John. And obviously, off late, it's been a lot of word of mouth and a lot of marketing that's being done by Indri. They're fabulous too. Uh, but keep in mind, if you actually walk into any social club, or if you walk into a place like Bob's Bar or any of these places, you will realize that predominantly a lot of people do incline towards blended whiskey even today. Although that's sort of changing. I mean, with time, things change, and change is the only constant. With a lot of introduction to single malt, uh, especially in India, over the past 15 to 18 odd years, the graph is actually moving upward, which is a very good thing. And also because brands like Amrut, Paul John, and off late Indri, they've really given a chance for our beautiful country to be placed in the world. Paul John's won many awards across their expressions. Amrut, for sure, too. The fusion is still a very big hit, and the Indri Trini, which is definitely picking pace and doing a lot of making a lot of noise, off late. I also would like to cover that a lot of people in these social clubs are still in a traditional old school setup of consuming blended whiskey, whether it be Indian blended whiskey, blended Scotch, whatever it might be. Say right from, let's say, a Royal Stag to a Ballantines or 100 Pipers and black and white, very high selling blended whiskies, right? Blended Scotches. But we do have one such amazing single malt that was solely introduced, I feel, for the purpose of changing that trend. I wouldn't like to call it an entry level single malt because it's far beyond that, but we'll come back to that, right? So, how is single malt made? So, like I said, one distillery, all barley. So, the barley is procured. Traditionally, in Scotland, they use two row barley. In India, they use, or rather, we use 6 row barley. Now, 6 row barley has a lot more protein and a lot more um, flavor or profile, you know, to offer. So any distiller in India would not really have the challenge of trying to make a very malt forward whiskey, right? Because it's already there. That's said done. You know, there are different regions in the world which make single malt. So in the US, you call it American single malt. In Scotland, we call it Scotch, single malt Scotch. In India, we call it Indian single malt. The Japanese have their own style too, which is called Japanese single malt. So, a distillery would procure barley from their local source or local farmer or local yield that gets produced in and around the vicinity, or in some cases, they do travel quite a distance. So, don't be baffled. I mean, we are obviously speaking of different regions of where single malt probably hails from or where they're present. What are the different countries that make single malt? But just remember, it's the same. I don't mean same, but you got to remember that it's one distillery making all barley whiskey. That's it. It's as simple as that. However, what differentiates them is the way they make their whiskey, is the casks they use, is the region it hails from, and every single region has its own laws that each distillery has to follow, right? So, for example, in Scotland, if you want to make a single malt, you have your distilled spirit. It goes into a barrel. It has to be aged minimum 3 years by law. In India, yes, there's no specific law as such that highlights that there has to be a minimum age, but I'm sure because of the fact that we have a pretty tropical climate, like I said in my first video, right? There is going to be a lot more interaction with the wood. By that I mean to say whiskey will mature faster. So I know of distilleries who begin with a minimum aging of 3, not by law, very unlike Scotland, but whiskey gets aged between 3, 10, 11. We don't really have beyond 11-year-old. If you guys saw, Indri recently launched a collector's edition of the 11-year-old single malt, which retailed for about 35,000 rupees and only 120 bottles for Karnataka. So got sold in a minute or two. But you know we have different, like I said. So America follows, again, all barley, one distillery, but again between 3 and 5 because they're very similar climate like ours. But what happens is what differentiates Scotland to India, right? They are asked to age the whiskey for a minimum of 3 years, primarily because whiskey starts to interact very slowly, no matter what weather it is outside, and it takes a long time for it to age or interact with the wood, derive all the characters that the barrel is offering, or wherever the whiskey is being aged. In our country, again, repeating myself, but we have pretty tropical climate, quite tropical climate, right? So, for example, if you compare Amrut is from Bangalore, Paul John is from Goa, right? Two different kinds of climate conditions. You have humidity in Goa, we don't have humidity here. So when the aging process in a single malt takes place, naturally Goa would age a little faster, it's a little ahead when it comes to um, whiskey maturation, right? I'm going to keep this topic for another day of maturation in casks, etc. It's very, very interesting. So please don't forget to subscribe, and if possible, click the bell icon too. You will be notified as and when I create videos. So for today, and I'll tell you why I picked this one. We have the Paul John Nirvana. A lot of people call this as an entry level single malt. Fair enough. I mean, I'm not going to go against anybody's views or anybody's perception on it. This is how the bottle looks. It's at 40%, which means it's chill filtered, right? Wow, that is this bad boy is making me want to drink him. I mean, it's not the first time I'm having this, but still, from what I remember, Nirvana, rather even the Nirvana from the Paul John um, offering, used to come with a cork. Right now they have a guala cap, and which is not bad, but still, cork obviously enhances the whole whiskey experience. I mean, I'm going to keep this here. So I'm going to take you guys through what it is on the nose, what it is on the palate, and the finish. It's a very, very clear cut ex bourbon aged whiskey, very golden color. Wow, man. I mean, there's quite a bit of citrus I'm getting on the nose. A lot of honey and caramel. Yeah. There's a bit of wetness. I would say wetness as in like a bit of dampness to this whiskey. So it is pretty salivating, but it's very, very elegant on the nose. I mean, like I said, it's at 40%, right? So this is a chill filtered whiskey, without a doubt. So like I mentioned in the previous video, anything below 46 has to be chill filtered. Interaction of air has settled down a bit already. It's not a bad sign. Getting a lot of fruit cake on the nose. Very, very, very elegant. It is very sweet, very honey, vanilla, and caramel forward. Apart from a bit of the dampness I'm getting, like I said. So let's go for the palate. Hmm. On the palate, it is fantastic, right? So elegant, so sweet, very, very malty, but it's not like a punch on the face. Very gentle maltiness that comes in, and there is a bit of spice and the finish. Yeah, there is a bit of warmth, quite a bit of warmth, and it's a very, very sippable, easygoing, this whiskey and just enjoying every single sip. It is so friendly, like I said, very, very enticing in the sense, the mouth is salivating quite a bit, But it's the elegance that's bringing me back. It's something that is so mellow and it's so inviting. If you're just beginning to explore the world of single malt, this bad boy is the go-to whiskey. So coming back to how single malts are made, in the sense what really happens during the process of making of single malt. So the barley gets acquired by the distillery. Now this barley gets stored in tanks until when, that's a brilliant one, until when it needs to be used for production. The different steps that are involved to get the liquid that goes behind this bottle, and there are quite a number of steps that every distillery follows, right? So the journey of whiskey making begins with malting and steeping, right? So malting is basically um, is the process of sort of trying to get the barley, or okay, rather let's put it this way: steeping is the process in which barley is submerged in water, typically for a few days, in lukewarm to hot water, temperature controlled again. And when you alternate soaking and draining, you sort of engage or allow the barley to have, you know, um, its moistness, because there is water present in it, right? Once that's done, you let it rest in the air, or you let it rest, you know, for it to basically raise, or rather, the barley interacts with air, which also has moisture, to trigger germination process. Now, what is germination? It's nothing but, think of how at home you put a little seed, you put soil, you add water, and you allow you allow the seed to sprout. That's exactly what germination is in barley as well. So during this process of steeping, you got to realize that all the active enzymes that are present in barley, which are essential for converting starch, which is present, into sugars, which is the most important thing for fermentation to take place, like fermentable sugars, right? And post this, basically, you have to really stop at one point. You have to stop the germination process at one point, primarily because you have to dry the barley, which now has these sugars. You can either do it in two different ways. That's why you see peated and unpeated whiskies. Now, either if you're using peat, all the semi-wet barley is basically put into, a furnace of sorts, and peat is burnt at high temperatures, which basically gives out that sort of flavor, which is absorbed by the barley. Whereas in a case of unpeated whiskey, just use direct, probably sunlight, under direct heat. You got to halt the germination at one point, because if it sprouts, then the sugars are not going to be as easy for you to get out of the barley, because it's going to be eaten by the sprout for it to grow as well. So you got to stop germination. And now, when you want to move to fermentation from this whole process of steeping, this is called nothing but malt, or dried malt, right? So then it's basically ground, or the one that I just spoke about a while back, into something called as a grist. I mean, you have these barley particles with hot water in the mash tun, right? So that's then changed once your malting is done. You put it into your mash tun, where this grist is formed, and it's allowed to rest after a point. So this basically extracts sugars into the liquid. Basically, when you add these into um, uh, the fermentation tank, there's something called a wort that's formed. The wort is then, this wort, prior to fermentation, the wort is then fermented with yeast to create ethanol and congeners. It's as simple as that. But the process, however, it takes quite some time, right? Fermentation can happen between a minimum of 30 hours to probably a max of 72 hours, depending on the flavor profile that somebody is looking at in, the distillery or at the distillery. So post that, this whiskey is distilled in copper still, like I mentioned. Aging, is also where the magic takes place. So, on this note, I would like to sign off and have my Paul John Nirvana on this wonderful evening. Thanks for joining me in. Super, super happy that you're here. Cheers.